China has built the largest high-speed rail network in history, 45,000 kilometers of track as of 2023. In just 15 years, it laid enough rail to circle the equator, connecting megacities at 350 kilometers per hour speeds. Yet, here's the twist. Only about 6% of those shiny new lines actually turn a profit. The vast majority run deep in the red. Meanwhile, Japan's bullet train network is far smaller, roughly 3,000 kilometers of Shinkansen lines built over 6 decades. But those lines are consistently full of paying customers and operate in the black. In fact, Japan's rail operators run perhaps the world's busiest and most profitable commuter rail web, with Greater Tokyo's trains moving around 20 million people every day and reliably making money. It seems counterintuitive. China's system is bigger and faster, but Japan's is making it work smarter. China's high-speed rail network is gargantuan, and that scale is its own story. In 2007, China had virtually zero true high-speed rail in operation. Fast forward to the end of 2023, and it has 45,000 kilometers of HSR tracks spreading across the country. That's 2/3 of all the world's high-speed rail, built in about 15 years, a construction spree with few historical parallels. China laid over 3,600 kilometers of new rail lines in 2023 alone, including 2,800 kilometers of high-speed lines. To put that in perspective, in 1 year, China built almost as much high-speed track as Japan's entire Shinkansen network. By early 2025, projections showed China hitting 46,000 kilometers of HSR and aiming for a whopping 70,000 kilometers by 2035 under ambitious national plans. This massive scale means that Chinese bullet trains reach almost every province. The marquee routes, like Beijing to Shanghai, Beijing to Guangzhou, and Shanghai to Shenzhen, span thousands of kilometers across the country. Trips that once took 20+ hours by slow train now take 4 to 8 hours on a fast CRH, China Railway high-speed train. Whole regions have been pulled closer together. Beijing to Shanghai, 1,300 kilometers, can be done in 4.5 hours on the fastest train, and the system extends outward to smaller cities that never had world-class rail service before. Japan's approach couldn't be more different in pace. Japan's Shinkansen network grew gradually since 1964. The first line, Tokyo to Osaka, 515 kilometers, took about 5 years to build, and then Japan added lines bit by bit over decades. By 1975, the line extended west to Fukuoka. By the 1980s and 90s, new lines reached northern Honshu, the Tohoku Shinkansen, and so on. Now, about 60 years after the first bullet train, Japan has roughly 9 Shinkansen lines, totaling approximately 2,950 kilometers. So China built 15 times Japan's length in a fraction of the time. What enabled China's breakneck expansion? Money and political will. The Chinese government treated HSR as a nation-building project. After the 2008 financial crisis, it poured stimulus funds into rail construction. State banks lent billions to rail projects. Local governments were eager to get stations in their cities, sometimes for prestige, and engineers rapidly copied and improved technologies, some imported from Japan and Europe in the early days. The result? An HSR, great leap forward. By 2020, China had completed the initial blueprint, a 4+4 grid of high-speed lines, 4 north-south and 4 east-west trunks, now evolving into an even denser web of routes. Japan, by contrast, faced more constraints. Building in Japan's mountainous, densely populated terrain is slow and expensive. Every new line requires dozens of tunnels and viaducts to maintain gentle curves and grades. While early Shinkansen lines like the Tokaido were limited to roughly 2% gradients, newer lines like the Kyushu Shinkansen have had to conquer steeper inclines of up to 3.5%. Even with these engineering advances, construction remains arduous. Unlike the original Tokaido line, which was built relatively cheaply on flat coastal plains, modern lines must pierce the Central Alps. For instance, the recent Hokuriku Shinkansen extension consists of nearly 80% tunnels and bridges, costing roughly 13 billion yen, approximately $85 million, per kilometer, triple the cost of earlier eras. So Japan built lines more judiciously, where demand was highest, and even paused construction at times when the national rail company fell into debt. More on that later. China's costs were also high. Building ultra-fast lines across vast distances isn't cheap anywhere. In flat areas, Chinese HSR construction has been quoted around 100 million yuan per kilometer, roughly $15 million, and up to 300 to 500 million yuan per kilometer in rugged terrain. Whole mountain ranges had to be pierced with tunnels and bridges. China's network is full of record-length bridges. But Beijing could absorb these costs at a national scale and keep pushing forward. By 2022, China's government aimed to invest about 800 billion yuan, approximately $110 billion, in rail each year, fueling continuous expansion. Japan, in recent years, spends less on new rail, though it is still actively tunneling the massive Hokkaido Shinkansen extension to Sapporo and constructing the Chuo Shinkansen maglev line. The scale gap is clear. China has built a network for coverage, connecting 100-plus cities, whereas Japan built for concentrated corridors. In practical terms, a traveler in China can hop on a high-speed train from, say, Guiyang in the southwest and ride clear across the country to Beijing. In Japan, you can't reach every city by bullet train, but the key metro areas are linked, stretching from Kagoshima, southern Kyushu, through Honshu and up into Hokkaido, currently terminating at Hakodate. And one more difference: train frequency. On China's regional lines, frequency can be sparse, but on its busiest arteries like Beijing to Shanghai, the system rivals Japan's intensity, running over 100 train pairs daily with departures every few minutes. Japan's Tokaido Shinkansen route similarly operates like a metro line. During peak hours, up to 12 to 15 high-speed trains per hour in each direction, a train every 4 to 5 minutes, all day long. Japan compensates for fewer lines by running tons of trains on them. That means even with only approximately 3,000 kilometers of track, Japan's high-speed system carried about 310 million passengers in fiscal year 2023. By comparison, China's high-speed rail network has seen a massive post-pandemic rebound, handling nearly 3 billion annual passenger trips by late 2023. While China's absolute volume is roughly 10 times higher, it operates on a network 15 times larger. Per kilometer of track, Japan's lines remain significantly more distinctive for their density and utilization intensity. It's like China built a freeway network spanning a continent, while Japan built a smaller number of super-busy rail highways, where every segment is packed. Scale has its advantages. China's rail connects places that were previously hard to reach efficiently, boosting mobility for millions. But it also has drawbacks when expansion outpaces demand, which leads us to the next issue: getting passengers the last mile and actually filling those trains. Building thousands of kilometers of track is one thing. Getting passengers from their homes to those shiny new stations is another. This is the last mile challenge, and it's an area where China and Japan diverge significantly in urban planning and rail integration. In China, many high-speed rail stations aren't in city centers. They're often built on the outskirts of town, sometimes 10 to 20 kilometers away from the historic urban core. Why? Because it's cheaper and easier to build new high-speed lines in less developed areas, avoiding dense downtowns. Also, many Chinese cities already had an older central railway station, so the new HSR station got sited in a suburb or a newly planned district. City officials often hope to develop these areas into new business centers around the station, but in a lot of cases, that development hasn't fully materialized yet. The result is what Chinese media dubbed ghost stations. Imagine a massive modern station with capacity for thousands of travelers, but only a trickle of passengers. Since 2010, China Railway had to close 20 high-speed stations due to lack of passengers, many in smaller inland cities where the HSR stop was too far out and inconvenient. Local governments built grand stations in the middle of nowhere, to quote internet memes, expecting growth that never came. One notorious example: Tongren South Station in Guizhou, nestled in the mountains 60 kilometers from the city it's named after, requiring over an hour's taxi ride to reach. Hardly anyone used it, and it was essentially a white elephant until services were reduced. There are multiple such cases where stations were placed with poor accessibility, and the rail operator ended up scaling back service or shuttering them to cut losses. Now, to be fair, not all Chinese HSR stations are remote. In big cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, The main high-speed terminals, Beijing South, Shanghai Hongqiao, Guangzhou South, are within the urban area and connected by subways. And even along the flagship Beijing to Shanghai HSR, the average station is about 9 kilometers from the city center, not 20 kilometers as some critics claim. Many have metro lines or buses linking them. But the broader pattern is that China's network prioritized reaching new cities quickly, even if that meant plopping stations in outer districts and hoping the last mile would be solved later, with metros, feeder trains, or highways. In fast-growing cities, that's sometimes okay. Chinese cities are expanding outwards so rapidly that a remote station might become surrounded by new neighborhoods in a decade. Still, for a traveler today, it can be a hurdle. You arrive by bullet train, but then you might need a 30 to 60-minute taxi or bus ride to actually get downtown or to your appointment. That extra friction can discourage use, especially for shorter trips where flying or even driving might land you closer to city center. Japan's approach to station placement is much more integrated. Almost every Shinkansen station is located in or next to an existing city center. Tokyo Station, the central nexus of the network, is smack in the middle of downtown Tokyo. Lines radiate both west, to Osaka/Hiroshima, and north, to Sendai/Hokkaido, from this single hub. Osaka's Shinkansen hub, Shin Osaka, is a few kilometers from the city center, but it's directly linked by local trains and subway, 10 minutes to the main Osaka station hub. Smaller cities. If you take the Shinkansen to, say, Niigata, Nagano, or Hiroshima, you arrive right in the city downtown. The stations are typically the same ones the city has used for decades, or new stations built adjacent to old ones for easy transfers. The last mile in Japan is usually the last 100 meters. You step off the bullet train, and you can often just walk or take a short metro hop to your final stop. This difference is rooted in urban planning. Japanese cities grew up around train stations, especially post-war. The rail companies, like JR East or private lines, often own the real estate in and around their stations, shopping malls, office buildings, hotels. So they have a vested interest in bringing people into the station, not stranding them in the suburbs. In Tokyo, for example, major stations like Shinjuku, Tokyo, or Shibuya are vibrant city centers, by design. A rider's journey seamlessly continues from Shinkansen to local train to maybe a short walk to the office. China historically didn't have that pattern. Many cities were more car-oriented in their recent development, or had one central station mainly for conventional trains. When HSR came along, designing entirely new station districts was a novel challenge. Some places have done it well. For instance, Shanghai Hongqiao is a huge integrated transport hub with an adjacent airport and metro lines, effectively forming a new urban center. But others remain isolated. A Chinese commentator in 2024 noted the common plight. Can urban residents feel comfortable taking overcrowded local transport and multiple transfers just to reach the HSR station? Highlighting how that journey can be a headache. The government has noticed this issue. There are now efforts to build more connecting lines, like city centre tunnels, to bring high-speed services into downtown, similar to Europe's idea of through running. Some major cities are adding these links so that in the future, a bullet train might continue onto older tracks closer to city centre. Another part of last mile is local transit availability. Here, Japan shines. Its cities have comprehensive metro and commuter rail networks. Greater Tokyo alone has over 880 interconnected rail stations and roughly 40 million rail trips per day. Many people making transfers count twice. Practically anywhere you need to go, there's a train or subway nearby, or a short bus ride. This makes using trains, including Shinkansen, very convenient end-to-end. China's big cities are rapidly expanding their metros. Places like Beijing and Shanghai now each have 700+ kilometers of subway lines, among the longest in the world. So in megacities, the integration is improving. But in medium-sized cities, local public transport might not be as developed, and taxis or cars fill the gap. There's a cultural angle too. Car ownership in China soared in the 2000s and 2010s, whereas in Japan, owning a car in a city is costly and often unnecessary. So a Japanese commuter is more likely to hop on a train for that last leg out of habit and convenience, whereas a Chinese traveler might be more inclined to drive or hail a ride if the station is far. What's the impact of the last mile gap? It affects ridership and usefulness. Some of China's HSR lines have lower than expected ridership, partly because people can't easily get to the stations or choose slower trains that stop downtown. A telling statistic: in early 2024, when millions of migrant workers went home for Chinese New Year, many avoided high-speed trains and took the old slow, green trains, because those old trains, while taking longer, were cheaper and often depart from city centre stations. It meant HSR trains were underutilized on weekdays or during travel peaks, even when there was demand to travel, simply because of cost or access issues. To counter this, China Railway has started adjusting. In 2024, they even cut some ticket prices and train frequencies on underused lines and are trying to coordinate better with local transport. But the fact remains, if it's a hassle to reach the high-speed station, people won't ride, and the fancy infrastructure sits idle. Japan largely sidesteps this by virtue of its compact city layouts and integrated networks. When you take a Shinkansen in Japan, you know you'll arrive where you can easily catch a connecting train or even walk to many destinations. This first and last mile strength is a big reason Japan's rail system gets high utilization. Here's a stark contrast. China's high-speed rail expansion came with a mountain of debt, while Japan's private rail companies have turned their networks into profit centers. Start with China. Building 45,000 kilometers of high-speed lines wasn't just technically challenging, it was extremely expensive. The Chinese government effectively footed the bill through its state-owned enterprise, the China State Railway Group. To finance construction, China Railway took on massive loans. By the end of 2024, China Railway's total liabilities, covering high-speed, conventional, and freight infrastructure, had swollen to roughly 6.2 trillion yuan, about $860 billion. While this debt encompasses the whole railway system, the rapid expansion of the high-speed network is the primary driver of this financial burden. To give a sense, 6.2 trillion yuan is roughly 5% of China's GDP and still growing each year. Is the high-speed network making enough money to service that debt? Not even close. Operationally, only a handful of China's HSR lines earn a profit from ticket sales. According to a national audit report cited in 2024, the entire high-speed system lost about 100 billion yuan in a single year. And by official stats, out of 45,000 kilometers of lines, just 2,300 kilometers, around 6%, were profitable by end of 2023. Those profitable segments are basically the busiest corridors in rich coastal areas. Beijing to Shanghai, Beijing to Tianjin, Shanghai to Nanjing/Hangzhou, Guangzhou to Shenzhen, the ones linking huge city pairs with high demand. Everything else loses money, at least on a pure operating basis. There were 16 major high-speed lines, and only 6 made money. The rest have too few passengers or tickets too cheap to cover operating costs, let alone the billions spent to build them. China's railway operator has been bundling its finances. It combines HSR and conventional rail in its reports, and traditionally the old slower trains, and especially freight services, were profitable and helped subsidize passenger routes. In fact, moving freight, like coal and goods, historically gave China Railway a steady income, which it used to offset high-speed rail losses. By 2023, the company had already returned to the black, reporting a small overall profit of roughly 3.3 billion yuan, a trend that continued into 2024. However, this is after lumping everything together nationwide. It's a razor-thin margin, approximately 0.3%, and masks the fact that HSR alone is largely underwater. To help matters, in mid-2024, the government allowed a hike in ticket prices. China Railway raised fares up to 20% on the profitable high-speed lines so they could use that extra revenue to subsidize the money-losing lines. Essentially, they're charging more on Beijing to Shanghai so they can keep running trains to less populated regions. Why does China tolerate these losses? Because profit was never the only goal. The government views high-speed rail as a long-term economic driver, a public good like highways or airports. It's expected to boost development in poorer interior areas, knit the country together, and enhance mobility for all citizens. Those benefits, jobs created, growth stimulated, are hard to quantify on a balance sheet. Officials often emphasize the social value of the network over commercial returns. So while the debts are large, the central government can ultimately absorb or refinance them. Indeed, there's speculation it may eventually write off some debt or inject capital to relieve China Railway. In one case, the flagship Beijing-Shanghai High-Speed Railway Company, which operates the busiest line, is actually profitable, earning 12.7 billion yuan net profit in 2024 on that single line. But even that line, with 210 million annual riders, would need about 20 years of profits to pay off its construction cost of 221 billion yuan. Many other lines may never recoup their build cost from fares alone. The central government seems willing to accept that, as long as the broader economy reaps rewards. Switch to Japan's side. Japan's rail system was once drowning in debt too. By the 1980s, Japanese national railways accumulated 25 trillion yen in debt building Shinkansen lines and running unprofitable rural routes. That led to the 1987 privatization and breakup into JR companies. Since then, the major JR companies have become quite profitable in their core areas. The busiest Shinkansen routes, like JR Central's Tokaido Shinkansen, Tokyo to Osaka, are cash cows. The Shinkansen lines in Japan consistently cover not only their operating costs, but also depreciation and capital expenditures. For example, JR Central, which runs the Tokaido line, had, in pre-pandemic times, on the order of 440 billion yen annual net profit, approximately $4 billion, largely thanks to the Shinkansen's high-ticket revenues. Overall, the privatized JR East, JR Central, and JR West were all posting healthy profits in the 2000s. Even after maintaining their tracks and trains, they had surplus to invest or pay dividends. So, we have 45,000 kilometers of debt versus a profitable commuter web, as the subtitle said. China's railway ministry, now company, took on debt to rapidly build, not worrying about immediate returns. Japan's rail companies, after a painful reform, focus on profitability, which limits how and where they expand. But in the context of high-speed and urban rail, Japan's model has produced a sustainable ecosystem, high-speed lines and commuter lines that feed each other passengers and revenue, whereas China's is more of a state-subsidized expansion that may take decades to financially equilibrate, if ever.